Intersecting orbits, Eliza Novak counted the seconds between thunderclaps as she hurried toward the entrance of the Hawthorne building. Boston's notorious spring storms had ambushed the city again, and her thin raincoat offered minimal protection. Inside the marble-floored lobby, she shook droplets from her curly auburn hair and nodded at Gregory, the elderly security guard who had worked there since the historic building's restoration 15 years ago. "Cutting it close today, Dr. Novak," he observed, sliding her access card across the desk. "The forecast said afternoon showers." "The forecast hasn't met New England weather," she replied with a smile, checking her watch. She had 30 minutes. Before her presentation to potential donors for the Coastal Ecosystem Research Initiative. As the youngest lead researcher at 33, Elise felt constant pressure to prove the initiative deserved its funding and space on the building's 11th floor. She made her way to the bank of elevators, tapping her foot impatiently as the center car descended from the upper floors. The doors slid open to reveal a man about her age, tall with warm brown skin and thoughtful eyes, partially hidden behind wire-framed glasses. A guitar case was slung across his back. Their eyes met briefly, the familiar acknowledgement of strangers who recognize each other without actually knowing one another. She'd seen him perhaps a dozen times over the past few months, always with that guitar case, always heading to the 14th floor where a recording studio occupied half the space. "Morning," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Morning," she echoed, pressing the button for 11. The elevator hummed as it climbed, filling the silence between them. Elise stared at her reflection in the polished doors, mentally rehearsing key points from her presentation. From the corner of her eye, she noticed him gently tapping rhythms against his thigh, a musician's unconscious habit. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, she stepped out and for a fraction of a second thought he might say something more. But the doors closed, carrying him upward, and she dismissed the notion as wishful imagination. Later that afternoon, after successfully securing a promise of continued funding, Elise treated herself to tea at the small cafe on the building's ground floor. She chose a quiet corner table and spread out her research notes, losing herself in data about declining mussel populations along Massachusetts Bay. "Is this seat taken?" The voice startled her. Looking up, she found herself facing the elevator. Man who stood holding a steaming cup and a leather-bound notebook. "All yours," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair. The cafe had filled while she worked, leaving few available seats. "Thanks. I'm Rohan, by the way. Rohan Mehta." He set down his cup and extended his hand. "Elise Novak." His handshake was firm, but gentle. "You work with the Ocean Research Group?" he asked, nodding toward her papers covered with tide charts and species distribution maps. "Marine biology," she confirmed, surprised he knew. "How did you—" "I saw the presentation room being set up this morning. Ocean conservation posters and a very intimidating display of shellfish mortality graphs." Elise laughed. "They're only intimidating if you're a pollutant. Or someone who flunked high school biology," he countered with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm more comfortable with quarter notes than quarterly reports on ecosystem health." "The studio on 14, she said, connecting the dots with his guitar. "You're a musician?" "Composer. Mostly for independent films, occasionally for commercials when rent is due." He tapped his notebook. "Working on something new today." Outside, rain continued to fall, streaking the cafe windows and casting the afternoon in a gentle blue light. For the first time in months, Elise felt no urgency to return to her data. Instead, she found herself curious about the man who rode. The same elevators, but existed in a completely different world, a world of sound and emotion rather than specimens and statistics. "What kind of film is it?" she heard herself ask, closing her research folder. Rohan's eyes brightened. "A documentary about vanishing coastal communities. Actually," he paused, looking at her notes, "I think we might be more connected than we realized." resonant frequencies. The Hawthorne building had stood through a century of New England storms, but this particular Thursday's tempest seemed determined to test its historic foundations. As thunder crashed overhead, the lights throughout the building flickered once, twice, then surrendered to darkness. Elise had been working late, analyzing tissue samples from the latest research expedition. When emergency generators failed to kick in immediately, she sighed and reached for her phone's flashlight. The building manager's voice crackled through the emergency system. "Please remain calm and proceed to the emergency stairwells. The elevators are temporarily non-operational." Gathering her essential notes, Elise made her way to the stairwell. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow as she began her descent from the 11th floor. Around the 9th floor landing, she heard footsteps coming up. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber. "Going down?" Rohan's familiar voice replied as he emerged into view, his face half illuminated by his own phone light. "I was recording when everything went dark. Thought I'd check if anyone needed help getting down." "That's surprisingly gallant," Elise said, surprised by how pleased she was to see him. "Not entirely altruistic," he admitted with a smile. "The silence in the studio was getting eerie. I'd rather face a power outage with company." They continued. Down together, their conversation bouncing off the walls along with their footsteps. When they reached the 5th floor, an unsettling metallic groan stopped them in their tracks. The emergency exit door had magnetically sealed, a security feature gone awry in the power failure. "Well," Rohan said after they tried the door with no success. "It seems we're temporarily residents of Stairwell B." Elise slid down against the wall with a sigh. "At least we're not stuck in an elevator." Small mercies. Rohan joined her on the floor, setting his phone flashlight upright to create a makeshift lantern. "So, Dr. Novak, since we appear to have time, tell me something about the ocean that would surprise me." The simple question launched them into a conversation that flowed from marine biodiversity to musical composition, from her childhood summers on Cape Cod to his parents' classical music school in Chicago. They discovered unexpected overlaps. Both had lived briefly in Seattle. Both preferred autumn to any other season. Both harbored an inexplicable fondness for old lighthouse stories. "I've been working on a piece inspired by tidal patterns," Rohan confessed after nearly an hour of conversation. "But I can't quite capture the rhythm. The mathematics behind ocean movements is fascinating but beyond my grasp." Elise's eyes lit up. "That's literally what my doctoral thesis explored, mathematical modeling of tidal influences on coastal ecosystems." She grabbed her notebook and began sketching wave patterns. "It's all about periodicity and harmonics. Actually, it's not that different from music theory." Rohan leaned closer, their shoulders touching as he studied her diagrams. The proximity sent an unexpected current through Elise, more surprising than the power outage itself. She hadn't felt that particular kind of awareness in years, not since before her last relationship imploded under the weight of her research commitments. "You see," she continued, trying to focus, "if you think of tidal movements as a complex symphony rather than individual waves, the resonance creates patterns." Rohan finished her thought, excitement in his voice. He hummed a sequence of notes, then another overlapping set. "Like this, but translated into sound." When the lights finally flickered back to life 90 minutes later, both seemed almost disappointed. As building security came to unlock the door, Rohan helped Elise to her feet. "I should thank the storm," he said, gathering his things. "I just solved a compositional problem I've been struggling with for weeks." "Glad my tidal obsession could help," she replied with a smile. As they finally emerged into the lobby, Boston's night sky had cleared to reveal stars rarely visible through the city's usual light pollution. They stood for a moment at the building's entrance, neither quite ready to end the evening. "I don't suppose," Rohan began hesitantly. "Yes?" Elise prompted. I have a recording session tomorrow afternoon. If you're not busy with saving marine ecosystems, maybe you'd like to hear what your tidal mathematics sound like when translated to music. I'd like that, Elise said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. I'd like that very much. Walking to her car, Elise couldn't help but smile at the irony. It had taken complete darkness for her to finally see the man she'd been passing in elevators all these months. Tidal patterns. Their first intentional meeting at the recording studio marked the beginning of what Elise privately termed the most unexpected collaboration of her professional life. What began as a one-time visit to hear Rohan's tidal composition evolved into a standing Thursday afternoon ritual. The studio on the 14th floor became familiar territory, a space of rich acoustics, vintage equipment, and the peculiar comfort of watching someone completely immersed in their element. Elise would bring her research, ostensibly to work while Rohan recorded, but increasingly found herself drawn into the creative process. "Listen to this," Rohan would say, adjusting his headphones before playing a sequence he'd composed based on the migratory patterns of North Atlantic right whales. "Does this capture the movement?" "Almost," she would reply, closing her eyes to better visualize the oceanic choreography. "But their winter journey has more hesitation. They pause near the Georgia coastline." And he would nod thoughtfully, fingers already reworking the melody to incorporate this biological truth. Meanwhile, Rohan began appearing at her research presentations, silently supportive in the back row. When questioned by her curious colleagues, Elise explained their arrangement with scientific detachment, an interdisciplinary project translating marine biological data into compositional frameworks. A description that felt simultaneously accurate and woefully incomplete. "You've infected my professional vocabulary," Rohan accused good-naturedly one evening, as they shared takeout Thai food on the roof garden of the Hawthorne building. The space was technically reserved for tenants of the luxury apartments on the upper floors, but the building manager had a soft spot for Elise's conservation work and occasionally granted her access. "I caught myself telling my producer that the soundtrack needed more ecological authenticity. He thought I'd joined a cult." Elise laughed, tilting her face to catch the last rays of the September sunset. "And my research team is convinced I'm having some sort of midlife crisis because I used the phrase emotional resonance of data in our last methodology meeting." Something about the golden hour light made Elise acutely aware of how comfortably they occupied each other's space now. How Rohan's hand rested inches from hers on the bench. How he'd unconsciously adopted her habit of tucking hair behind her ear when concentrating. How she'd begun using his expressions when explaining complex concepts. Their worlds had begun to synchronize in subtle ways. She found herself humming his compositions while collecting field samples. He'd started reading her research papers, sending thoughtful questions at odd hours when inspiration kept him working through the night. They maintained separate orbits, but had established a gravitational pull between them, predictable points of intersection that both looked forward to with increasing anticipation. "Your birthday is next week," Rohan said suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. "How did you know that?" "Gregory mentioned it. Apparently, he's planning to bring you his wife's famous blueberry muffins." Rohan's eyes held a mixture of amusement and something warmer. "I was thinking of something different." "Oh?" Elise raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "There's a small marine research station on Plum Island. They're doing a nighttime bioluminescence tour that evening. I thought—" He hesitated. "I thought you might like to go. With me. For your birthday." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. This wouldn't be their usual coffee between recording sessions or impromptu lunch in the building cafe. This would be deliberate, intentional. A date. "I'd love to," she replied softly, feeling suddenly shy despite the months of growing friendship. The evening of her birthday proved magical in ways Elise hadn't anticipated. Rohan arrived at her apartment with his car already packed with thermoses of hot chocolate and warm blankets. The coastal drive north featured a specially curated playlist of ocean-themed music, none of it his own, a humility she found endearing. On the darkened beach, they joined a small group of fellow science enthusiasts. As the marine biologist guide explained the phenomenon of bioluminescent dinoflagellates, Rohan listened with such genuine interest that Elise found herself watching him more than the glowing waters. "It's like the ocean has captured stars," he murmured, as blue-green light swirled around their kayak paddles. Later, as they sat on the beach watching the midnight tide advance, Rohan reached for her hand. Unlike their accidental touch months ago in the elevator, this contact was deliberate, his fingers carefully interlacing with hers. Neither spoke, both watching the waves rhythmically illuminating with each crest. "Happy birthday, Elise," he said, finally, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the surf. She turned to face him, suddenly understanding that, like the microscopic organisms making the ocean glow, some connections only become visible in the right conditions, at the right moment. And perhaps this, the quiet beach, the bioluminescent waters, his hand warm in hers, was exactly the right moment. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning toward him as naturally as the tide drawn to shore. Their first kiss tasted of salt air and possibility, brief but promising like the bioluminescent flash of waves breaking against the sand, a momentary brilliance hinting at deeper mysteries below the surface. Undertow, winter descended on Boston with characteristic ferocity, transforming the Hawthorne building's elegant exterior with crystalline frost patterns that reminded Elise of coral microstructures. Inside, holiday decorations appeared in the lobby, and Gregory, the security guard, distributed peppermint candies along with the usual access cards. The seasonal transformation coincided with a shift in Elise and Rohan's relationship. What began as occasional dinners evolved into weekends spent together, wandering through museums, attending underground jazz performances where Rohan knew the musicians, or simply coexisting comfortably in her apartment as she analyzed research data while he composed at her kitchen table. "We're domesticated now," Rohan teased one Sunday morning as they navigated her small kitchen in a synchronized breakfast preparation routine that had developed without discussion. "Next thing you know, we'll be finishing each other's—" "Don't." "You dare say sentences?" Elise interrupted, pointing her coffee mug at him accusingly. "That's terminally cliched." "I was going to say research grants, actually," he replied with a grin, stealing a piece of toast from her plate. Elise's laugh faded as she remembered the email sitting unopened in her inbox. A preliminary inquiry from the Wellington Oceanic Institute in New Zealand about a senior research position. A dream opportunity with unparalleled funding and access to deep-sea research vessels. An opportunity on the opposite side of the world. "Everything okay?" Rohan asked, immediately attuned to the change in her expression. "Just work stress," she deflected, unwilling to disrupt their peaceful morning. The eternal funding battle. But the unopened email nagged at her throughout the day, a dissonant note in their harmonious weekend. By evening, as they walked through snow-covered Boston Common admiring the holiday lights, Elise couldn't contain it any longer. "I've been offered a position," she blurted as they stood watching ice skaters circle the frog pond, "in New Zealand, leading a deep-sea conservation initiative." Rohan's hand tightened slightly around hers before he turned to face her. "That's incredible, Elise. When would it start?" "March," she replied, studying his face for reactions he was clearly working to control. "It's a 3-year appointment, with potential for permanent status." 3 years, he repeated softly. The unspoken implication hung between them. 3 years, minimum, on opposite sides of the planet. "I haven't accepted yet," she hastened to add. "It's preliminary, but it's the kind of opportunity marine biologists dream about. Rohan nodded, slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "You should take it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm she could see in his eyes. "Just like that?" The words came out sharper than intended. "What do you want me to say, Elise?" His composure cracked slightly. "That you should turn down your dream job for this?" He gestured between them. "We've been together, what, 3 months?" "4," she corrected automatically, then felt foolish for the precision. What difference did a month make against 3 years and 16,000 kilometers? They walked home in strained silence, both retreating into professional shells that had grown uncomfortably thin in recent months. At her apartment door, Rohan kissed her forehead, a gesture somehow more devastating than if he'd simply said goodnight. "I have that film festival in Chicago this week," he reminded her. "Let's talk when I get back, okay? When we've both had time to think." The week of Rohan's absence stretched endlessly. Elise threw herself into work, staying late at the lab and avoiding the building's cafe where memories lurked at their usual corner table. The deadline to respond to Wellington loomed, demanding a decision she felt increasingly unable to make with clear judgment. On Thursday, breaking their tradition of meeting at the studio, Elise found herself restlessly wandering the Hawthorne building after hours. Somehow she ended up on the 14th floor, outside the now familiar studio door. Using the key Rohan had given her for emergencies or inspiration, whichever strikes first, she let herself into the darkened space. The room still held traces of him. Coffee mug on the console, notes scribbled on the whiteboard, a sweater draped over the chair. On impulse, she sat at the piano where she'd watched him work countless times, her fingers hovering over keys that had translated her scientific data into haunting melodies. Her phone buzzed with an email notification, Wellington requesting her final decision by Monday. With a deep breath, Elise placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the simple pattern Rohan had taught her, the musical translation of tidal movements. The familiar notes echoed in the empty studio, each one pulling her in opposing directions, forward toward professional fulfillment, back toward a connection she hadn't anticipated but now couldn't imagine relinquishing. When the studio door opened behind her, Elise didn't need to turn to know who stood there. Like creatures evolved to sense changes in oceanic pressure, they had developed an awareness of each other's presence that transcended ordinary perception. "Your flight doesn't get in until tomorrow," she said, fingers still moving slowly across. "The keys." "I took an earlier one," Rohan replied, setting down his bag. He moved to stand beside the piano, watching her hands. "You're playing it wrong." "I am not," she protested automatically. "You are," he insisted, but there was no criticism in his voice, only a gentle observation. "You're playing the outgoing tide pattern. It's all withdrawal, no return." He sat beside her on the bench, their shoulders touching as he positioned his hands on the higher octaves. "The full tidal pattern includes the return," he demonstrated, adding the complementary notes that completed the cycle she'd begun. "The pull away and the coming back." Elise felt tears threatening as the metaphor registered. "Rohan!" "I've been thinking all week," he interrupted, his hands still moving across the keys, creating a backdrop to his words. "About tidal forces and gravitational pull. About how some things are meant to experience separation and return, cyclical by nature." He stopped playing and turned to face her fully. "Take the position, Elise. But New Zealand has film industries. They have composers, they have studios." His eyes held certainty where she'd expected conflict. "And Boston has marine research initiatives that would welcome you back after 3 years. You'd wait?" she asked, hardly daring to believe what he seemed to be suggesting. "No," he said, and her heart dropped until he continued. "I wouldn't wait. I'd follow for part of it. We'd make it work, commuting between hemispheres if necessary, Remote collaboration when we can't be in the same place. His hands found hers on the piano keys. The tide always returns, Elise. It's the nature of the system. The simplicity of his solution, not without challenges but fundamentally optimistic, broke through days of circular thinking. Of course, they could find a pattern that accommodated both their professional needs and their connection. They'd been translating disparate systems into harmonious relationships from the beginning. "We'll need to be intentional," she said, thinking practically even as relief flooded through her. "Set clear time frames for visits, budget for flights." Intentional, Rohan agreed with the smile she'd missed all week. Like composing a piece that spans continents. As snow fell silently outside the studio windows, they began planning their unconventional future, mapping visits and project overlaps with the same precision Elise applied to her research methodologies. The distance remained a reality, but no longer an insurmountable obstacle. Later that night, as they walked to the elevator together, Rohan pulled her close before the doors opened. "I almost forgot," he said, reaching into his bag. "I brought you something from Chicago." He handed her a small, elegantly wrapped package. Inside, Elise found a vintage compass, its needle trembling slightly before pointing decisively north. "No matter how far the distance," he said quietly as the elevator doors opened. "We'll always know how to find our way back." Surface tension. 18 months later, Elise stood at the railing of the research vessel Moana Nui Akea, watching dawn break over the Tasman Sea. The southern hemisphere winter painted the horizon in shades of violet and amber that no photograph could adequately capture. Her research team would be awakening soon, ready for another day of documenting the previously unrecorded deep-sea thermal vent ecosystems they'd discovered last week. As senior research director, she should have been reviewing the day's dive schedule or preparing notes for the evening's data analysis. Instead, she found herself counting time zones, calculating the hour in Boston where Rohan would be finishing a recording session for the documentary series that had grown from their initial collaboration, a project now nominated for prestigious environmental film awards. Their relationship had found its rhythm despite the geographical challenges. Technology helped. Video calls, shared digital workspaces, collaborative online projects. But the true foundation of their connection was built on more tangible exchanges. Packages containing vials of seawater from exotic locations that he transformed into compositions. Scores he sent that she played during research expeditions. His surprise visits to Wellington between projects. Her scheduled returns to Boston that aligned with his performance deadlines. The scientific community had initially raised eyebrows at her unorthodox arrangement, 3 months in New Zealand, 1 month in Boston, repeat, but the unprecedented success of her research program silenced most critics. Similarly, Rohan's music industry colleagues questioned his refusal of certain projects that would conflict with their scheduled time together, until his compositions for the Oceanic documentary series earned international recognition. "Dr. Novak?" Her assistant's voice interrupted her reflections. "Satellite call for you from Boston. Priority line." Elise's heart quickened as she took the communication device. Only certain contacts had access to the ship's priority channels, and most would respect the time difference unless truly urgent. "This is Novak," she answered, trying to keep professional detachment in her voice despite her concern. "The tide is turning," Rohan's familiar voice replied, using their private shorthand for significant developments. "What's happened?" she asked, gripping the railing tighter. "The International Marine Conservation Fund approved our joint proposal," he said, excitement evident even across thousands of miles of satellite connection. "Full funding for the traveling educational exhibition. All 5 continents, starting next spring." Elise gasped, momentarily speechless. They'd worked on the proposal for months, an ambitious project combining his immersive soundscapes with her interactive scientific displays designed to bring ocean conservation awareness to communities worldwide. That means, she began, mind racing through implications. That means we'll both be traveling to the same locations, he finished. Together. For at least a year. A year, she repeated, the word tasting like possibility on her tongue. After 18 months of carefully rationed time together, the prospect of sustained proximity seemed almost unreal. There's more, Rohan continued. The Wellington Symphony Orchestra wants to commission an oceanic symphony based on our collaborative work. A permanent position, Elise, in New Zealand. The weight of his words settled around her like the pressure of deep water, not crushing but enveloping, significant. You'd move to Wellington? She asked carefully, unwilling to presume. If that's where you want to be, he replied simply. The exhibition gives us a year to decide, to see if Boston calls you back, or if Wellington becomes home for both of us, or if we find somewhere new entirely. The sun had fully emerged now, turning the sea's surface into a canvas of shimmering gold. Elise thought about the journey that had brought them here, from brief elevator encounters to a relationship that spanned oceans, one that had transformed both their professional landscapes in unexpected ways. What about your studio? Your connections in Boston? She asked, knowing how central the Hawthorne building had been to his career. The Hawthorne was sold last month, he told her. They're converting it to luxury condominiums. Even Gregory is retiring. The end of an era, Elise murmured, feeling a pang for the place where their story began. Or the beginning of a new one, Rohan countered. The building served its purpose, Elise. It brought us together. Now we get to decide where we go from here. Through the satellite connection, she heard familiar notes begin to play, the title composition he'd created during their early collaboration, but evolved now into something richer and more complex. I've been working on this, he explained, as the melody unfolded. Listen to the middle section. Elise closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. The composition had matured, incorporating elements from recordings she'd sent from expedition sites around the world. Antarctic ice movements, tropical reef soundscapes, the distinctive calls of marine mammals they'd tracked together across different oceans. It's beautiful, she said when the piece concluded. What are you calling it? Surface tension, he replied. The force that allows unlike elements to maintain connection despite opposing pulls. The scientific phenomenon that lets water striders walk on oceans. The research vessel's bell rang, signaling the start of the day's operations. Soon her team would be emerging, equipment would be prepared, and the delicate dance of deep-sea exploration would commence. I need to go, she told him reluctantly. Dive operations starting. I know, he said. 3 more weeks. Then you're back in Boston. One last time before the exhibition launch. One last time before we start the next chapter, she corrected gently. After ending the call, Elise remained at the railing for a moment longer, watching the interplay of light across the water's surface. She thought about surface tension, the molecular forces that created a barely perceptible boundary between air and water, strong enough to support weight yet flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions. An apt metaphor, she decided, for what they had built. A connection resilient enough to span continents, yet adaptable enough to accommodate their individual journeys. Not without its challenges, but ultimately stronger for having weathered them. As she turned to join her research team, Elise smiled at the memory of that first accidental touch in a crowded elevator. How neither had pulled away immediately, both somehow sensing that moment of contact would expand into something neither could have predicted, but both now couldn't imagine living without. Like the ocean itself, their story had depths and currents, rhythms and mysteries still unfolding. And like dedicated explorers, they would continue charting their course together, discovering new territories within themselves and each other with each passing tide.